"Put that post down," I screamed, my voice cracking as the sound of splintering wood echoed through the morning air. The man at the center of it all, Rick Dalton, our HOA president, didn't even flinch. He stood there like a general on a battlefield, barking orders at two hired workers who were tearing down my backyard fence plank by plank. The steady thud of hammers drowned out my pleas, and each strike felt like a violation, like someone was peeling away a layer of my privacy, my dignity, my home. I ran barefoot across the lawn, grass cold and damp beneath my feet, heart pounding. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted, stepping between them and the remaining panels. Rick glanced at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He adjusted his sunglasses and said calmly, "Community property, ma'am. HOA guidelines don't allow private barriers taller than 4 feet. This was never yours to begin with." I could barely breathe. The fence had been there for 2 years, approved, inspected, and built with my own money. It marked the edge of the yard I'd worked so hard to keep beautiful, the same one where my tenants' kids played every weekend. "That's a lie," I shot back, pointing at the stack of lumber now piled on my driveway. "I got county approval. You can't just—" Rick cut me off with a lazy wave of his hand. "Permits don't override community standards. Maybe next time, check with me first." The arrogance in his voice made me tremble, not out of fear, but rage. The workers didn't even look at me. They just kept going, tossing boards into a trailer as if they were trash. I turned toward my neighbors' houses, desperate for someone to intervene, but all I saw were blinds twitching and curtains closing. Everyone knew how Rick operated. He'd fine the woman across the street for painting her door the wrong shade of blue. He'd made a single dad replace his mailbox 3 times. No one dared to stand up to him. "Rick, you have no right," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I'm the property owner here. You don't get to decide what I can or can't build." He took a slow step toward me, the afternoon sun glinting off his watch. "Owner?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You rent this place out, don't you? As far as the HOA's concerned, tenants have no standing. And if you're not living here full-time, you don't either." I froze. "What are you talking about?" Rick smiled thinly. "This neighborhood has changed, Emily. We're tightening control, cleaning up violations, protecting property values. You should thank me." He turned to leave, signaling for the workers to finish up. My pulse thundered in my ears. "You can't just take my property," I shouted after him. "You're stealing." He stopped, turned halfway, and gave me a look that sent a chill straight down my spine. "Stealing?" he repeated, almost amused. He wiped the sweat from his miver brow, eyes narrowing in mock pity. "You might want to check your paperwork before throwing around words like that." I frowned, confusion mixing with anger. "What does that mean?" Rick leaned closer, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You don't even own this house anymore." For a moment, the world went quiet. The sound of hammering faded, replaced by the distant whine of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I stood frozen, gripping the splintered edge of my fallen fence as his words sank in. The man who had just destroyed part of my property was now claiming it wasn't even mine. And the worst part was, the smug look on his face told me he had something to back it up. "I'm not asking again," Rick barked, his voice booming through the quiet HOA office. "Either comply or face daily fines. You're just a tenant here." The word tenant echoed in my head like an insult. I stood there, my palms sweating, staring at the man who had torn down my fence just a day ago, now acting like he owned my home. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting a dull yellow glow over the beige walls lined with HOA pamphlets. Behind a scratched reception desk sat a young clerk, her nails clicking against the keyboard as if my existence was just another nuisance in her day. "I'm not a tenant," I said firmly, pulling my deed from my folder. The paper was slightly worn from the years I'd kept it in a file cabinet, but my name, Emily Carter's, was printed clearly on the top line. "I bought this property myself, and I have the county permit for that fence." The clerk barely looked up. "Only owners can file appeals," she said in a tone that dripped with indifference. "I am the owner," I snapped, placing the deed right in front of her. She glanced down, sighed, and turned toward Rick, waiting for him to decide how to respond. As if her own words didn't matter. Rick adjusted his tie, clearly enjoying the control. "Miss Carter," he said, drawing out the title like it was a joke. "Your ownership isn't the issue. The issue is compliance with community standards. New regulations went into effect last month. No fence over 4 feet, no exceptions." He slid a packet of stapled papers across the counter. The top page read, "Updated HOA Structural Guidelines, effective immediately." My stomach tightened as I flipped through. The date at the top was 2 weeks ago, long after my fence had been built and approved. "This is ridiculous," I said, shaking my head. "You can't enforce a new rule on something that existed before it. My fence was approved by the county." Rick leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "County rules don't mean much here. The HOA governs aesthetics, not you." I laughed. But it wasn't humor. It was disbelief. "You think your little rulebook outranks county law? That's not how property ownership works." He smirked, the kind of grin that told me he'd done this to others before. "You'll find out soon enough. Either bring your property into compliance or pay the daily fine. $500 per day, until full removal." I could feel my pulse pounding behind my eyes. "You've already removed it," I said, my voice cracking. "What exactly am I paying for now?" "Your ego." Rick's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He just gave the clerk a slight nod. She typed something on her computer, then slid a new document across the counter. A formal violation notice, complete with a digital signature and the HOA seal. "You'll receive further correspondence soon," Rick said, straightening up. "I'd suggest taking care of it before we escalate." I wanted to scream, but instead, I gathered my papers and turned to leave. As I stepped outside, the dry Texas heat hit my face, carrying with it the faint smell of cut grass and asphalt. My hands trembled as I clutched the deed. It was proof, undeniable proof, that this property was mine. But standing there in that parking lot, I felt powerless. Like the truth didn't matter to people like him. Back at the house, I spent hours at the kitchen table comparing my county permit to the HOA's so-called new rules. The dates didn't lie. My approval was legitimate, signed off months before any HOA changes. County permits override HOA amendments, I reminded myself, repeating it like a prayer. But when night fell and I stepped outside to get some air, I saw something new taped to my front door. A thick, official-looking envelope stamped in red ink. I pulled it off with shaking fingers, reading the bold letters across the top. "Notice of lien intent. Immediate attention required." The air seemed to leave my lungs. They weren't done tearing down my fence. Now they were coming for my home. "She doesn't even own that place," someone whispered as I walked past the row of metal mailboxes. I could feel their eyes on me. Neighbors I'd waved to for years now, looking at me like I carried a disease. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, smiles vanished, and doors shut a little too quickly. I'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know how gossip worked. Fast, cruel, and always exaggerated. But this time, it wasn't about anyone else. It was about me, and I didn't have to wonder where it started. By the end of that week, the rumors had spread like wildfire. Someone said the HOA had seized my property because of unpaid fees. Another claimed my tenants were squatting illegally. A woman I barely knew told my mail carrier that I was about to lose everything. Each lie felt like a small stone thrown through my reputation, cracking what little peace I had left. It didn't take long for the harassment to start up again. My tenants, Jake and Lindsay, a young couple with 2 little kids, called me in a panic one evening. "We got this letter," Jake said, voice shaking, through the phone. "It says we're violating occupancy limits for having unauthorized guests." I frowned. "You mean your kids?" He sighed. "Apparently so. It says if we don't correct the issue, we'll be fined $100 a day." I could practically hear the frustration in his voice. They were good people, quiet, respectful, always paid rent on time. I promised to handle it, but as soon as I hung up, another email notification popped up on my phone, a copy of the same violation sent directly to me. That was the moment I realized what Rick was doing. He wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, he was creating them on the fly, punishing me through paperwork, making my tenants' lives miserable to force me into compliance. And the scariest part? No one was questioning it. Everywhere I went, whispers followed. At the grocery store, the community pool, even at church. "She's the one fighting the HOA," I heard someone mutter once. "You don't cross Rick, he'll bury her in fines." I stopped trying to explain myself. Words didn't matter when power was on his side. So instead, I started doing what I knew best. Documenting everything. Every letter, every conversation, every notice slipped under my tenant's door. I started a spreadsheet. Dates, names, times, even photos of each document. If Rick wanted a fight, I'd make sure it was one fought with evidence. One afternoon, while checking the mail, I saw Rick standing by the clubhouse with a few other board members. Their laughter drifted across the parking lot. I pretended not to look their way, but as I turned to leave, I caught my name in the middle of their conversation. Rick's voice carried, smooth but venomous. "She'll break soon," he said, chuckling. "They always do. Once she's out, we'll take her lot for resale. Clean it up, make it something respectable again." My heart pounded so hard I thought they'd hear it. He wasn't just trying to intimidate me. He was plotting to take my property. The fence was only the beginning. This was a full-blown campaign to push me out. I forced myself to keep walking, each step heavier than the last. The neighbors' stares burned into my back, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake trying to fight this alone. Still, deep down, one thought began to form. Quiet but firm. If Rick Dalton wanted a war, he'd just declared it on the wrong woman. "Move your car, or it's getting towed," Rick yelled across the street like he owned the police. His voice carried over the entire cul-de-sac, loud enough for everyone watering their lawns to hear. I looked up from my garden hose, stunned, as he pointed toward my car, parked neatly in my own driveway. "What are you talking about?" I shouted back, wiping my hands on my jeans. Rick strutted toward me with a clipboard under his arm, that same smug grin plastered on his face. "Parking violation," he said flatly. "Driveways are for temporary use only, not overnight parking." I blinked at him, trying to process what I'd just heard. "It's my driveway, Rick." "My property," he shrugged. "Not according to community policy. Your tenants' vehicles have been marked too. We can't have this neighborhood looking like a used car lot." I followed his gaze to see the small orange sticker slapped on my tenant's car windshield. My stomach twisted. The bright label read, "Violation. Subject to tow." The same notice was now taped to my mailbox too, printed with bold red letters. That was the moment I realized Rick wasn't just enforcing rules. He was using them as weapons. Later that afternoon, I checked my email. 5 new messages from the HOA, each one colder than the last. The subject lines alone made my blood run hot. Unauthorized rental activity. Non-owner occupancy violation. Pending compliance action. The body of the emails accused me of renting my property without prior HOA authorization. But I'd been leasing to Jake and Lindsay for over a year, and no such rule had ever existed. This was a brand new attack. I grabbed my lease agreement and my old HOA welcome packet, flipping through it frantically. Nothing. Not a single clause about rental restrictions. I called Rick's office. "There's no bylaw about this," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You can't just make things up." Rick didn't even bother denying it. "New rental restrictions were passed last quarter," he said smoothly. "Applies to everyone now." "That's not how it works," I shot back. "You can't apply rules retroactively. My lease was already signed." He laughed softly. "Then maybe you should have read the fine print, Miss Carter." By evening, the harassment had spread. My tenants texted photos of new citations left on their porch. Grass height exceeds community standard. Unauthorized exterior lighting. The grass had been trimmed that morning, and the porch lights were motion sensor bulbs, both perfectly within code. Jake called me, furious. Are they serious? We can't even mow the lawn right now without them watching. I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. The whispers, the warnings, the fake rules. It was all orchestrated. Rick wanted control, and humiliation was his favorite tool. Still, I started saving every single document. Photos, timestamps, emails. I was done reacting. Now I was collecting evidence. And while I documented every lie, I began digging into the legal side. Rental restrictions can't be applied retroactively. If my lease existed before their new amendment, I was protected. The law was clear, even if Rick pretended otherwise. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I could fight this. Maybe I could prove everything he was doing was illegal. But that moment didn't last. At sunset, a courier arrived at my door with a thick white envelope. My name was printed in all caps, and across the top, a red stamp bled through the paper. Notice of legal action. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a letter from the HOA's attorney, warning me that continued defiance could result in foreclosure proceedings under lien authority. I sank onto the porch step, the paper trembling in my grip. Rick wasn't bluffing anymore. He was coming for everything I owned. "Ma'am, you'd better sit down," the clerk said quietly, lowering her voice. "That document he filed, it's fake." For a moment, I just stared at her, unsure if I'd heard right. The air inside the Travis County Records office was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of old paper and toner. My pulse quickened as I leaned closer to the counter, my hands gripping the edge until my knuckles went white. "What do you mean, fake?" The clerk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, turned the computer screen toward me. "The amendment he submitted banning fences over 4 feet high. It was filed last month. But look here, the date stamp has been digitally altered." I squinted at the image. The font on the seal looked slightly off, darker than the others on file. Next to it, the notary's signature looked scanned, not signed. "You're saying he backdated it?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. The real filing date is May 10th, but on his copy, he typed in March 23rd, 2 months earlier. It's a bad forgery, honestly." My stomach dropped. Rick Dalton had actually gone that far, forging official records just to justify tearing down my fence. The arrogance, the entitlement. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. I swallowed hard. "Can you give me a copy of that?" She hesitated, glancing around the room. "Officially, we can only release documents to involved parties." "I am the involved party," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He used that to destroy part of my property. I need it for my case." Her eyes softened. After a moment, she nodded and hit print. The printer whirred, spitting out a set of papers that could expose everything. She handed them to me discreetly, then leaned in close. "Listen," she said, voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not the first one to come in about him. 2 other residents asked about strange filings from your HOA president. Both backed out when we mentioned affidavits." "Backed out?" She nodded. "They said they didn't want trouble. One of them even moved." That familiar tightness crept back into my throat. Rick had silenced people before. He knew how to scare them, through fines, threats, and humiliation. I tucked the papers into my folder, my mind spinning. Backdating HOA filings is document fraud. That meant criminal territory. I finally had something solid. Proof he'd broken the law. I thanked the clerk and started toward the exit, the weight of that folder feeling heavier than it should. As the automatic doors opened, a rush of humid Texas air hit my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was holding a weapon instead of just defending myself. I walked across the courthouse steps, my heels clicking against the concrete, each step fueled by a mix of anger and relief. My hands were still shaking when I reached the parking lot, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was adrenaline. I had evidence, proof, a way to fight back. Then I froze. Across the street, parked half in the shade, sat a silver SUV I knew too well. The one with the HOA decal in the back window. Rick's car. He was there. Through the windshield, I could see the outline of his arm resting on the steering wheel, sunglasses glinting in the sunlight. Watching, waiting. My grip tightened around the folder. I didn't need to see his smirk to know it was there. He knew exactly where I'd gone, and as I stood on the curb, staring at him from across that narrow strip of asphalt, I realized the fight had just escalated from petty fines to something far darker. A man willing to forge government documents to destroy me wasn't going to stop now. "Go ahead, record me," Rick shouted during the HOA meeting. So I did. The clubhouse was packed that evening, folding chairs lined up in neat rows, the air thick with cheap coffee and tension. I sat near the back, phone resting innocently on my lap, camera pointed down but microphone on. My hands were steady even though my heart wasn't. After what I'd found at the county office, I knew tonight could change everything. Rick stood at the front of the room behind a cheap plastic podium, his posture stiff, his smile rehearsed. "We're here," he began, "to address the continuing non-compliance issues involving property at Lot 42, Miss Emily Carter's residence." Dozens of heads turned toward me. Some eyes held sympathy, others fear. A few just looked away, pretending to be interested in their papers. "First of all," Rick continued, tapping his stack of documents for emphasis, "Miss Carter's fence was in clear violation of HOA regulations, which were approved by this board months ago." I bit my tongue. Backdated and forged, I thought. I wanted to stand up and shout the truth, but instead I pressed record and stayed silent. A man in the front row raised his hand. "Didn't that rule go into effect after her fence was built?" Rick's jaw twitched. "The timing is irrelevant. The board has the right to enforce new standards retroactively to maintain consistency." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Can they even do that?" That's when he turned his fire toward me. "You know," he said, staring straight at me, "Miss Carter has been parading around the county office accusing this board of fraud, making wild claims." I stayed seated, calm, collected. "Not claims," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Facts. You filed a fake amendment." A few gasps echoed through the room. Rick's smile faltered for a second, just long enough for me to see the crack beneath his confidence. Then he laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Fake? Please. Those documents were adjusted to fit updated policy language, that's all." And just like that, he said it. The words I needed. Adjusted to fit policy. I kept my eyes forward, pretending to take notes, but inside I was shaking. Not with fear this time, but adrenaline. That single sentence was enough to expose everything. The room started to turn restless. A few homeowners muttered among themselves, confused. "Adjusted?" one asked aloud. "You can't just change official filings." Rick's voice rose above the crowd. "Enough, this meeting is over." He slammed his hand against the podium, papers fluttering to the floor. "We're not entertaining baseless accusations." He stormed out through the side door, leaving the board members scrambling behind him. The room buzzed with murmurs and quiet outrage. I slipped out quietly before anyone could stop me, my phone still recording in my hand. Outside, the warm Texas night air hit me like a wave. Crickets chirped in the distance, mixing with the hum of passing cars. I took a long breath, feeling the smallest flicker of victory. For the first time, I had him. In his own words. Legal nugget. Texas is a one-party consent state. As long as one person involved in a conversation knows it's being recorded, and that person is you, it's completely legal. By the time I got home, my heart had finally slowed. I plugged my phone into my laptop, saved the audio file, and labeled it carefully. HOA meeting, evidence. I thought I'd finally earned a moment of peace. But peace wasn't what waited for me. Around midnight, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number, no caller ID, just a text. "Delete that recording or lose your property." The screen glowed in the dark, lighting up my trembling hands. Whoever sent it knew exactly what I'd done, and they wanted me scared. But I wasn't deleting a thing. My face was on every community flyer. Dangerous landlord, do not engage. The first time I saw one, it was taped to the bulletin board outside the community pool. A grainy photo of me, taken from God knows where, printed beneath bold black letters accusing me of verbal aggression and property endangerment. My stomach dropped. Someone had gone to the trouble of making me a villain. By the end of the day, those flyers were everywhere. On mailboxes, clubhouse doors, even the light poles at the neighborhood entrance. And at the bottom of each one, in small print, was the HOA logo and signature, President Richard Dalton. I stood there staring at it, half angry, half numb. People walked past pretending not to notice. Others stopped, whispering behind cupped hands. It was official now. Rick had declared open war. Later that afternoon, my tenants called again. Jake's voice was tight, anxious. "Emily, what's going on? We just got an email from the HOA saying our lease might be revoked because you're under investigation." I closed my eyes, exhaling shakily. "You're not under investigation, Jake. This is him. It's all him." He sighed. "I know, but Lindsay's worried. If they start harassing us again, we might have to move." The line went quiet after that, and I couldn't blame him. They had kids, they needed peace. And thanks to Rick, I couldn't even give them that anymore. That evening, I logged onto the community Facebook page, and there it was. A long post from a profile with Rick's name and photo, warning residents about me. It accused me of filing false complaints, threatening HOA staff, and creating an unsafe environment for residents. The comments section was a circus of speculation and lies. "She always seemed off," one person wrote. "She yelled at my husband once over parking," another claimed. One even said, "Didn't she get caught renting illegally?" I sat at my desk reading the words over and over until the letters blurred. I hadn't realized how fast lies could become truth once they were printed and shared. By the weekend, I was the pariah of the neighborhood. People I'd hosted barbecues with now crossed the street to avoid me. Friends who used to drop by stopped calling. Even at the grocery store, I caught familiar faces turning away when they saw me in line. Rick had done what he set out to do: isolate me. I tried to focus on my plan, on the evidence I had, on the recording, on the county documents, but the emotional weight was crushing. Some nights, I couldn't even sleep. Every car that slowed down in front of my house made me wonder if another letter, another lie, another threat was on its way. Still, I forced myself to act like I was fine. I kept the house spotless, mowed the lawn, smiled at anyone who would look at me, because that's what he wanted, for me to break down publicly. And I refused to give him the satisfaction. But in private, I started researching. I needed to know exactly how far this could go. That's when I found it. Defamation by HOA officials isn't just unethical, it's actionable. If I could prove Rick's statements were false and damaging, I could sue. That realization gave me a flicker of strength. I printed out screenshots, copied flyers, even saved emails. Each piece of evidence became a small brick in the wall I was building against him. Then, one quiet Sunday afternoon, just as I began to feel like I was regaining control, there was a knock at the door. Through the window, I saw the brown uniform first, then the badge. The sheriff stood there, holding a thick envelope. "Emily Carter?" he asked when I opened the door. I nodded, my throat dry. He handed it over. "You've been served. Richard Dalton is suing you for defamation." The paper felt heavy in my hands, heavier than any lie he'd ever told. Rick wasn't done destroying my reputation. Now he was taking me to court for telling the truth. If he wants a war, fine, let's take it to court. Those were the first words out of my mouth when I met Laura Jensen, a property rights attorney with a reputation for tearing apart corrupt HOAs. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and steady-voiced, the kind of woman who didn't flinch at power. She dismantled it. I slid the growing stack of evidence across her desk: violation letters, photos, emails, and finally, the county-certified documents proving Rick had forged that amendment. Laura skimmed through everything, her pen tapping rhythmically against the table. "He backdated official filings?" she said, brows arching. "That's not just unethical, that's criminal." You've got him, Emily. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Within days, Laura filed a counterclaim. Fraud, harassment, and defamation. The moment it hit the court docket, the narrative flipped. Rick's lawsuit accused me of spreading false information. My counterclaim accused him of fabricating that information in the first place. We submitted the audio recording from the HOA meeting, the one where Rick admitted to adjusting documents to fit policy. We attached copies of the county filings showing mismatched seals, and we even had witness statements from 2 homeowners who'd overheard Rick bragging about getting rid of troublemakers. When Laura finished drafting everything, she leaned back in her chair. You've been playing defense long enough. Now we hit back. Word traveled fast. Faster than Rick could control it. By the end of the week, the lawsuit became the talk of the neighborhood. And for once, the whispers weren't about me. The local community Facebook group lit up like wildfire. Someone posted, "Did anyone else hear the HOA president is being sued for fraud?" Within hours, the comments flooded in. I knew something was off about him. He fined me for having the wrong trash can color. Finally, someone's standing up to that bully. I didn't post a thing. Didn't have to. The truth was spreading on its own now. Every screenshot, every piece of proof Laura filed became public record, and people started connecting the dots. By midweek, the tension inside the HOA board was visible. Meetings grew shorter, quieter. Board members started avoiding Rick in public. The woman who handled neighborhood landscaping stopped showing up altogether. Even the HOA newsletter, once filled with his self-congratulatory president's notes, went silent. Laura called me one evening after a court date had been set. "They're panicking," she said. "Dalton's attorney just filed a motion to delay. Classic stalling tactic. He's trying to buy time." "Time for what?" I asked. She paused. "To hold his board together. But from what I'm hearing, that won't last." She was right. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early and sat quietly in the back. The tension was so thick you could feel it. Rick stood at the podium, trying to talk about community improvements. But no one was listening. A few members shuffled papers nervously, others avoided eye contact altogether. Then out of nowhere, the treasurer, an older man named Greg Turner, who'd served on the board for years, pushed his chair back and stood up. "I can't do this anymore," he said loudly. Rick froze. "Excuse me?" Greg's voice shook, but he didn't back down. "I won't go down for your lies, Rick. I warned you months ago, and now look where we are. This whole board's a joke." He dropped his papers onto the table and walked out, the door slamming hard behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. Rick's jaw clenched, his face pale. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan overhead. I sat there, steady and quiet, watching the first real crack appear in his empire. He'd spent months trying to destroy my reputation. Now he was watching his own collapse. One resignation at a time. "Everyone's replaceable," Rick snapped, right before the county investigators walked in. The timing couldn't have been more poetic. He was standing in front of the HOA board, red-faced and sweating, lecturing his own members about loyalty, when the 2 investigators stepped into the room flashing badges. The room went silent. The faint buzz of the overhead lights suddenly sounded deafening. One of the investigators, a tall woman with a calm authority, spoke first. "We're here to conduct a financial audit of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." Rick's smug grin faltered. "An audit?" he said, trying to laugh it off. "I wasn't informed." The investigator cut him off. "It's in response to multiple complaints regarding falsified records and missing maintenance funds. We'll need access to all expense reports, board meeting minutes, and vendor contracts for the last 3 years." I sat quietly in the back, watching his confidence drain away. For months, Rick had treated this neighborhood like his personal kingdom. But now, that kingdom was cracking from the inside. The investigators set up at the long conference table, pulling laptops and folders from their bags. Rick shuffled papers nervously, muttering something about procedures and miscommunication. But the damage was done. The audit had begun, and I wasn't the only one who wanted answers. Over the next few days, Whispers spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. People who had once defended Rick now wanted his head. One neighbor, a retired accountant, told me she'd asked to see HOA financials months ago, but was denied. Another said she'd paid a special landscaping fee twice and never saw the work completed. The investigators didn't take long to find what we all suspected: missing funds, falsified receipts, payments to contractors that didn't exist, even gas reimbursements that Rick had filed under community patrol. When the report went public, the residents exploded. At the next community meeting, the clubhouse was packed wall to wall. People stood shouting over each other, demanding refunds, demanding resignations, demanding the truth. I stayed near the back, my phone still recording, watching it all unfold. A woman in the front row waved a stack of papers. "You charged us for pool maintenance for 3 summers in a row," she yelled. "The pool's been closed for 2. Another man shouted, "Where's the $8,000 from the Neighborhood Improvement Fund?" Rick pounded his gavel uselessly. "Order, order." But his voice cracked under the weight of the chaos. Someone yelled from the crowd, "You're finished, Rick." The irony was almost cinematic. The same man who once mocked me for fighting back was now drowning in the noise of angry homeowners demanding his accountability. And they weren't just yelling. They were acting. Several of them had already joined my lawsuit. What started as my personal war had become a full-blown community revolt. Legal nugget. Under most state homeowner statutes, any member of an HOA has the right to audit financial records and request transparency from their board. Refusal to comply is grounds for removal and legal action. Within a week, Rick was cornered. His board members stopped returning calls. The HOA attorney withdrew representation. Even the local news began sniffing around the story. That's when Rick's mask finally cracked. He stopped pretending to be the calm, collected leader. Now, he was erratic, defensive, paranoid, and angry. He stormed through the neighborhood at odd hours, knocking on doors, trying to explain himself. But nobody wanted to listen. The night before our court hearing, I got the voicemail. It came at 11:42 p.m. His voice was slurred, thick with rage and exhaustion. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Emily," he hissed. "I can make things disappear. People disappear." The message ended with the sound of him slamming something. Maybe a door, maybe his phone. I sat there in the dark, phone trembling in my hand, realizing just how far Rick was willing to go. His kingdom was crumbling, and desperate kings are the most dangerous kind. "Mr. Dalton, did you falsify these documents?" the judge asked. His silence said everything. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the ceiling vent. Rick sat at the defense table, his once polished appearance replaced by deep lines of exhaustion. The confident smirk he wore at HOA meetings was gone. He looked smaller now, cornered. I sat across from him, hands clasped tightly in my lap. The stack of evidence I'd spent months collecting laid neatly on the table before me. Laura Jensen, my attorney, rose from her chair, calm and deliberate. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about offense. It's about a man who believed he could rewrite the law for his own gain and destroy anyone who stood in his way." Rick shifted uncomfortably as Laura continued. She presented everything: the backdated filings, the forged signatures, the harassing letters, the defamation posts. Then she played the recording. The audio filled the courtroom. Rick's voice, confident and cocky, saying the words that sealed his fate. Those documents were adjusted to fit policy. Every juror turned their head toward him. The room seemed to freeze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't move. I wanted every person in that room to hear it exactly as I had. The arrogance, the carelessness, the proof. Rick's attorney tried to object, claiming it was taken out of context, but the judge overruled him. "The recording will stand," she said firmly. When it was Rick's turn to take the stand, his composure cracked completely. He fumbled through his testimony, stammering excuses about clerical errors and miscommunications. Laura pressed him hard. "Did you, or did you not, submit this amendment to the county with a falsified date?" Rick glanced toward his lawyer, then at the judge. I don't recall the specifics. Laura held up the county certified copy. Is this your signature? He hesitated. It appears to be. Then you recall enough, she said coolly. The jury watched him squirm, and when she finished, the judge leaned forward, her tone cutting through the silence. Mr. Dalton, the court does not take lightly the falsification of legal records or the abuse of authority within a governing association. Rick didn't say a word. He just sat there, face pale, hands clenched into fists. After closing statements, the judge took less than 20 minutes to deliver her verdict. This court finds that the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, under the direction of President Richard Dalton, acted unlawfully in its enforcement of fabricated regulations, harassment of the plaintiff, and defamation of her character. My breath caught in my throat as she continued. The HOA is ordered to void all fines and liens placed against Ms. Carter, issue a formal public apology, and compensate her for damages and legal fees. The words hit me like sunlight after a long storm. I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in months. Behind me, a few of my neighbors, the ones who'd quietly supported me all along, clapped softly before the bailiff hushed them. Rick's lawyer gathered his papers in silence, avoiding eye contact. Rick just sat there, staring down at the table, his empire of intimidation collapsing right in front of him. As we stepped out of the courthouse, the flash of cameras blinded me for a second. Reporters crowded around, microphones raised, asking questions about the verdict. Laura smiled politely and declined comment, but before we could reach the steps, I felt a presence behind me. Rick brushed past, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over, sweetheart," he muttered. He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept walking toward his car, his shadow stretching across the courthouse steps like the last stain of a storm that refused to die. "I'll build it again," I said, hammer in hand. "But this time, you'll watch me." The morning after the court ruling, I stood in my backyard, staring at the empty space where my fence once stood. The sunlight cut across the dewy grass, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel hostile. The air was quiet, calm, the kind of quiet that follows victory. I rolled up my sleeves, lifted the first board, and began to rebuild. Word must have spread faster than I expected. Within an hour, two of my neighbors, people who hadn't even looked me in the eye for months, showed up at my gate. One carried a toolbox, the other brought coffee. "Mind if we give you a hand?" the older one, Mrs. Lewis, asked with a small smile. I hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." Soon, more people came. Jake and Lindsay arrived with their kids, the little ones running around in the grass while Jake helped mix cement for the posts. Another neighbor brought sandwiches. Someone else dropped off a stack of unused lumber. It wasn't long before the sound of hammers, laughter, and conversation replaced the silence that had haunted this place for so long. Each plank I nailed into place felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. My dignity, my peace, my home. I could still remember the day Rick had stood right here, ordering workers to tear this fence down while I begged them to stop. Now that memory burned away with every swing of my hammer. At one point, I looked up and caught sight of a moving truck across the street. Rick's house. He stood on the porch watching the crew haul out his boxes. He didn't wave. He didn't even look angry. Just hollow. A man who'd lost his control, his crown, his audience. The community he once ruled was rebuilding without him. Literally and figuratively. By sunset, a for sale sign was stuck in his yard. No one walked over to say goodbye. As the last board slid into place, I stepped back to admire the fence. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore, it was a line of defiance. A symbol of what happens when you refuse to be bullied. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. Jake handed me a cold bottle of water and smiled. "You did it, Emily. You really did it." Lindsay nodded beside him. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." Their words hit harder than any hammer ever could. For months, I'd felt alone, like one voice shouting against a wall. But now, Standing here surrounded by people who had finally found the courage to speak, I realized something important. It was never just my fight. Rick had terrorized everyone. I'd just been the first one stubborn enough to push back. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the porch, watching the fence glow under the porch light. The neighborhood was peaceful again. No flyers, no fines, no tension hanging in the air. Just quiet, the kind that feels earned. For the first time in a long while, I felt safe, strong, whole. Then, just as I was about to head inside, I noticed an envelope tucked halfway under my welcome mat. There was no return address, just my name typed neatly across the front. I tore it open, expecting maybe a thank you note from a neighbor. But inside was a single sheet of paper. "We've heard what you did in Willow Creek," it read. "We need your help. Our HOA is worse." I stared at the words, the weight of them settling in. Another fight, another community, another tyrant somewhere who thought they could do what Rick did. I looked out at the fence one last time and smiled faintly. If they wanted help, they'd come to the right person. They stole my fence, tried to steal my name, but they forgot one thing. I don't break that easily. Months have passed since the courtroom verdict, but sometimes I still wake up expecting another notice on my door. Another email from the HOA threatening me with something ridiculous. Old habits die hard when you've lived under constant attack. For so long, I fought just to keep what was already mine. My property, my peace, my identity. But now, as I sit on my back porch looking out over the fence I rebuilt with my own two hands, I finally understand what that fight was really about. It wasn't just about wood, or bylaws, or fines. It was about control, about one man's belief that authority gave him the right to silence anyone who stood in his way. Rick Dalton thought he could bully me the same way he'd bullied everyone else. But he underestimated the one thing he couldn't file paperwork against: my resolve. That fence out there is more than lumber. It's a line I refuse to let anyone cross again. After the case closed, the HOA issued their public apology just as the judge ordered. It was brief and half-hearted, printed in the community newsletter between announcements about garage sales and gardening tips. But I didn't need their words. The silence in the neighborhood said enough. The people who once avoided me now waved when they saw me on the street. Some stopped to thank me, quietly admitting they'd been scared to speak up. A few even asked for advice. At first, I didn't think I had any to give. I was just a woman who fought to keep her home. But the more people came to me, neighbors from my own community, even homeowners from other towns, the more I realized how many were living the same nightmare. Overreaching boards, fake violations, threats disguised as policy enforcement. It wasn't just my story. It was happening everywhere. So I started sharing what I learned. I told them to know their rights, to keep physical copies of every bylaw, amendment, and permit. I taught them to document everything: photos, emails, timestamps, even phone calls. Because the truth doesn't matter if you can't prove it. And above all, I told them to fight smart. Not with anger, but with facts. HOAs thrive on fear. The moment you take that away from them, they lose their power. Soon, my inbox was full. Homeowners from different states wrote to me, telling stories that sounded too familiar. One woman's HOA tried to evict her for planting sunflowers in her front yard. Another man was fined for parking his veteran's motorcycle in his driveway. I started making calls, connecting them with the same attorney who'd helped me, even helping some gather their documents. Somehow, without meaning to, I'd become what Rick never could: a real community leader. Not because I wanted power, but because I'd learned what it meant to lose it. One afternoon, I stood outside my newly rebuilt fence, running my hand along the smooth wood. The sun was setting, and the sound of kids laughing carried across the street. Jake and Lindsay were grilling in their backyard again, their little ones chasing bubbles through the grass. That laughter, their peace, was worth every sleepless night, every hearing, every moment of doubt. Still, there's a part of me that can't help but reflect on what it all cost. The stress, The fear, the isolation. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But I'd do it all over again if it meant stopping people like Rick from abusing the system. Because justice, real justice, isn't about winning a case. It's about reminding people like him that homeowners aren't helpless. Before all this, I never saw myself as the kind of person who would take on an institution. I was quiet, kept to myself, avoided drama. But maybe that's why he thought he could get away with it. People like Rick count on our silence. They build their power on it. The moment you speak up, the moment you refuse to be intimidated, their entire foundation cracks. Now every time I walk past that fence I smile. It stands tall, stronger than before. Not because it's new, but because it was earned. Every nail, every board, every inch of it is a reminder. This is my home. And no one takes that from me again. So here's what I'll tell anyone watching this. Don't let them scare you. Don't let the letters or the fines or the titles make you forget who owns the ground beneath your feet. Learn the laws, stand your ground. And when they push back harder. Because if there's one thing this fight taught me, it's that strength doesn't come from power. It comes from persistence. What would you do if your HOA tore down your fence? Tell me below. And if you'd fight back, subscribe, because this story isn't the end. Next time, we'll meet someone who took their battle even further. A retired Marine who stood up to an HOA that dared to ban his American flag. And trust me, you won't want to miss that one.